Hi, I'm David Jeans. I'm a tech reporter at Forbes. Today I'm very happy to be joined by Alex Conrad, who's the editor of the Midas List. And I'm wondering, Alex, if you could give us a bit of a primer on the Midas List for those of us at home who are not living, breathing, eating venture capital.
Yeah, no problem, David. Thanks for having me. So I've been the editor of the Midas List for 10 years, and Forbes has been doing the list for 23 years. If you're wondering what the heck it is, why we've done it for so long, it is the ranking of the top tech investors in the world, venture capitalists we call them, and Forbes has been making that definitive data-driven ranking since 2000, with 1 year off during the financial crisis of the aughts,
Wow.
but for a very long time.
Maybe just before we launch into this year's list, could you give me a bit of an idea of like what you've seen over the past 10 years from when you started working on the list to now? Like, what's the major shift that you've sort of seen?
You know, it's interesting to see these different companies and investors kind of have these highs and lows over the list, in the years. We've seen three prominent people retire from last year's list. So some titans of the industry who people may have heard of before, like Gary Tan, who retired because he's now president and CEO of Y Combinator, a big startup accelerator. He's off the list this year. Then you have folks like Michael Moritz and Bill Gurley, who are investors in companies like Stripe and Uber. They have retired and they're off the list. Then you have all these new faces come on over the years thanks to newer companies, whether it's OpenAI or Airbnb going public or ByteDance in China.
So in the past year, there's been a lot that has changed in the tech space at large. I wonder how this appears in the list and what's been the major shift of the past 12 months.
On the one hand, the Midas List has been a little more stagnant in the last couple of years than I would have liked to see. I feel a little bit sometimes like that meme of John Travolta standing in the empty room kind of looking around, because we want to see more IPOs. And IPOs have been historically the biggest driver of the list, whether it was Google back in the day, to Facebook, to more recently a company like Airbnb or Snowflake and Enterprise. Those IPOs create huge liquidity events for their investors, and for the Midas List, that is the pinnacle. You want to be returning money to investors. That is what a venture capitalist is ultimately supposed to do. Lately, it's been more podcasting and tweeting, but making money is ultimately the name of the game for them. And so those IPOs are what you really want to see. And so one thing that's interesting with this year's list is you're seeing a couple companies like Snowflake and Airbnb on their last legs, but they were just so big that the IPOs that we've seen in more recent months haven't really had that effect on the list yet. A company like Rubrik was a great IPO, or Klaviyo last year, but they were kind of small compared to those Airbnbs. And so we're still seeing those older companies being big drivers on the list, with a big caveat of private companies like SpaceX and OpenAI starting to push people up the ranks.
Well, talking about OpenAI, I wonder just the AI question. Is AI driving up certain investors on the list this year?
It definitely is, and AI is a big theme on this year's Midas List. It starts with our number one of the list, Alfred Lin from Sequoia, who was number one 2 years ago and then dropped to number 3. He is one of a couple investors who are key backers of Sam Altman at OpenAI. Obviously, Sam and OpenAI have been in the news quite a lot recently, and not only for good news, plenty of kind of tougher news too, but it's a huge company in the AI space, and Sequoia and Alfred were instrumental in that behind-the-scenes effort last year to try to kind of keep Sam in power there. So it's a theme with him. You also see people like Reid Hoffman and Vinod Khosla moving into the top 10. Vinod is the biggest mover of people who are already on the list this year, going all the way into the top 10 from the 80s because he was the first institutional check into OpenAI. But then you see Hugging Face, Anthropic, other companies are starting to drive investors higher up on the list as well.
Any surprising newcomers that you've noticed?
We have actually more returnees, people who had dropped off the list and then are coming back on, like Randy Glein, a key SpaceX investor who dropped off the list for 10 years and he's back. He was on the first one I worked on, and then I never saw him again, and now he's back. So we're seeing some of these returnees, 8 of them back on the list, and only 6 true newcomers this year. But one of the more interesting true newcomers is someone I think you know, the co-founder of Anduril in defense tech, Trey Stevens at Founders Fund. So he's on the list for his investment in Anduril, as well as some other bets. And I think that's interesting to see maybe defense tech getting represented on the list. He's someone that you've also reported around as well in your coverage, right, David?
Yeah. I think that especially recently, we've been focusing a lot of our reporting efforts on looking at the defense tech space and more broadly that sort of clashing of ideologies of Silicon Valley and Pentagon. And it's actually born huge multi-billion-dollar companies. We're seeing a lot of unicorns emerge. But I think that there remains the big question mark over how investors and the general sector is going to view Anduril at a potential exit, because if Anduril makes a really solid exit, then it will boost the rest of the defense tech space. But if it's lukewarm or not what people are expecting, then it'll have a ripple effect that I don't think we can foresee at the moment. So.
Well, Trey being on there is now our flag planted for that category with Midas. But we have seen Palantir be a big driver on the list in the past. Peter Thiel is always pretty high on the Midas list. And what's interesting is that you don't get on Midas if you're a co-founder of one of these companies just for the equity of founding the company, although that is how a lot of these people become billionaires, not necessarily just their investments. But then folks like Trey and Peter also work at venture funds and invest in the companies that they've co-founded as well. And that's how they get onto Midas, which is why you'll see Peter there, you'll see Trey there, but not necessarily someone like Joe Lonsdale, who's been on the list in the past for Palantir, but is not on this year. So that's one kind of interesting quirk of venture capital.
What about how many are we seeing, more or less women on the list this year?
So we have 13 women on the list this year. That's 2 more than the past couple years. So slight improvement. Of course, we would like to see even better representation, moving more to that 50-50 over time. But 13% is a small improvement. One of the more notable returnees is Annie Lamont, the First Lady of Connecticut, who is the co-founder of a firm called Oak HTFC and has done some interesting digital health companies. We've also seen a notable newcomer woman from China, Annabelle Yu Long of Buy Capital, which used to be Bertelsmann's investment arm there. China, interestingly, has the same number of investors this year as last year, 17. But I would say it's kind of softer year for China because a couple of those investors, from what we've heard, are spending more of their time in Singapore and are increasingly not really China-based anyway. And we've seen Chinese investors drop down on the list a little bit. They're not quite as high up. And interestingly enough, 2 of the firms on the Midas list this year didn't exist last year because they are splinters of international firms that wanted to divest their Chinese business. So as you've written about, as we both know, for our audience to know, there's been a lot of pressure to divest certain Chinese businesses in the U.S. And so Sequoia and GGV Capital, which both put a lot of people on the list each year, splintered off their Chinese firms. So you see Hongshan, which is formerly Sequoia's China business, and Granite Asia, which was part of GGV, both now putting the same people on the list, but under a new banner.
Where do you expect that we're going to see that trend go? I mean, are we going to see less Chinese investors on the list in the years to come? Or
I do think it will be harder for Chinese investors to make Midas moving forward. I think that we're waiting to see if ByteDance, Shein, Temu, if these companies can actually go public. There was an interesting report just this week that Shein has had to maybe table hopes of going public in the U.S. And that historically was how these Chinese investors did so well on Midas, is their companies would get really big, they'd do business in the U.S., they'd go public in the U.S. I don't know if that's still going to happen. And I think what happens to ByteDance is a huge question mark, with the TikTok potential shutdown. So I would say maybe tougher times for China on the Midas list in the next few years.
Is there one big surprise that you came across when you were putting the list together where you were like, what happened there?
Well, I do think SpaceX is a really interesting company here because it is so big. It's valued approaching $200 billion that it's already as powerful as some public companies in putting people on the Midas list. But is it ever going to go public? Does Elon really want it to go public? There's been chatter that maybe Starlink, the satellite business that you've written about, might get spun out and go public. Maybe SpaceX goes public. What do you think? Do you think that's a possibility? Because that would be a massive driver on Midas, in future years.
It's another sort of TBD on the future of that company there too.
Awesome. Well, yeah, all in all, I would say it was an interesting year for Midas, where we saw AI moving up, maybe China moving down, some notable names saying goodbye to the list, becoming alumni of the list moving forward. But I do think that in the next couple of years, if we do see companies like SpaceX or others, Stripe is a great example, finally going public, that's when you may see a whole new herd of faces onto the Midas list in the future.
Alex, thanks for joining us.